Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for American Progress Action Fund. My name is Neera Tanden and I'm the president of CAP Action, and I'm thrilled you all could join us for this critical conversation about Russia's interference in our democracy, our election, and our institutions, and why a thorough, independent investigation is sorely, sorely needed. In his 1987 book, The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump wrote, "You can't con the people, at least not for long, because people will eventually catch on." And we're hoping that is the case these days. With each passing week, we discover deeper ties between members of the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence officials. Russia's interference in our election process and the possibility of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence represents a serious and unprecedented challenge to our democracy that requires a fully independent investigation in the Congress. We are all appreciative to know that there is an FBI investigation, but we do think the public needs and demands an independent investigation. And even just the news today about what has happened with Congressman Devin Nunes' chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee tells us that the demand should actually grow, not recede. So, Congressman Nunes' bizarre actions raise serious concerns about the committee's ability to lead an independent investigation, and though he has, quote unquote, temporarily stepped down, that demand continues. Thankfully, Congressman Nunes finally announced he is recusing himself, but we're not out of the woods yet. And that's why this discussion today is so incredibly important. We're honored to be joined by one of the strongest voices in Congress on this issue, Jim Himes. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee, one of 21 members. One of the members, Devin Nunes, kept in the dark when he made his secret trip to the White House in the last few weeks. Through his tough questioning and careful review of facts, Congressman Himes has been fighting each and every day to protect the integrity of our democracy and give the American people what they deserve: a thorough, nonpartisan investigation that gets to the bottom of what truly happened in our election process. And if you haven't actually seen Jim Himes' opening statement during the Intelligence Committee hearings a few weeks ago, I really recommend it. It went viral on YouTube, and it gave a clear statement of the challenges that need and questions that need to be answered. So, with no further ado, I welcome Congressman Himes to the stage.
Thank you, Neera, and thank you all for taking some time out of your day to have this very, very important conversation. I thought foolishly that I was going to have an hour earlier today to sort of collect my thoughts and think big and give you the sort of overarching explanations. And needless to say, I've had about 30 seconds given all of the news reports of this moment. And by the way, that's true every day. Just as you sort of think you understand the trajectory of the investigation or of the committee, something big happens and you're off in a different direction. My thought here, I was asked to sort of give you 10 to 15 minutes on what led to the investigation, where the investigation is, and perhaps where we're going. So I'll try to be disciplined about that and probably give short shrift to some really important topics like what the larger strategic gambit is of the Russians, because that's a very big deal. We are not alone in being attacked in the fashion we were attacked over the summer and in the election. It is happening now in France. It has happened in any number of European countries. This is a very deliberate strategic activity that the Russians undertake and that they've perfected over decades, back to when they were the Soviet Union. And it comes, of course, from not having the standing, the power, or the economic oomph to compete internationally in an open, face-to-face way, but it takes advantage of the fact that it's actually not that hard in systems, particularly that have been a little destabilized, to further destabilize those systems. So what happened? And let me just dispense with this, even though it's fairly obvious to all but the most aggressive partisans on the other side of the aisle. We were attacked. We were very deliberately attacked. The core of our democratic process was compromised, not by accident, not by anything that a rogue unit in the GRU or anyone else did in Russia, but by something that Vladimir Putin decided to do when he decided to create first create questions about our system. This is a really important thing to the Russian leadership, that we believe that our own system is rigged, that it is unfair, that democracy really doesn't work, that perhaps the answer is a strongman. And of course, that's been accomplished through a variety of means. You know what they are: the internet trolls, the social media, the bots that are out there creating all sorts of uncertainty in the way that most of us now get most of our news. It is very deliberate in the form of propaganda outlets. RT is funded, of course, by the Russian government, and it has a remarkable footprint. It's bigger than the BBC in some areas. It's as big or bigger than Al Jazeera in certain areas. And it is a mouthpiece for the Russian government. DC Leaks, WikiLeaks, to a greater or lesser extent, are part of this apparatus. And I say to a greater or lesser extent because we shouldn't think the way we might think as Americans. In this country, you're an intelligence officer or you're not. In Russia, you're an intelligence officer or you're not, but there's any number of other stops along that continuum of oligarchs and others who may wittingly or unwittingly serve the purposes of the Russian leader. And of course, we had the actual compromise, which I won't get into, but you know what it was. It's not subject to debate any longer. Our computer systems were penetrated, information was captured, our being political entities, NGOs, individuals, and you saw what happened. Who knows what sort of an effect it had. But regardless, sometimes folks on the other side of the aisle said, but it didn't make a difference. It doesn't matter. First of all, I'm not sure I buy that in a close election. But secondly, it doesn't matter. It could make a difference. And so we obviously need to understand what happened and put an end to it in future. So what is actually happening in the investigation? The investigation, first and foremost, we need to not forget what this is about. I am really interested, because it's my job to be interested, in the possibility that our unmasking policies are not what they should be, or that leaks are bad. That's all possible, and it is part of the daily oversight activities of the committee. And that's an important point. It is part of the daily oversight activities that we undertake to find out if, in fact, we are unmasking U.S. citizen information and intelligence intercepts in a legal and appropriate way. What this investigation about, of course, is really two things. One, answering the question that FBI Director Jim Comey disrupted the open hearing by acknowledging that the FBI is undertaking an investigation into, his words, possible coordination and links between the Russian effort and people associated with the Trump campaign. That is point number one. Point number two, which gets a lot less press, but is interesting, is if the answer to that question is yes or no, is it nonetheless possible that the Russians have some form of compromise on the United States president? Now, that compromise could take a lot of different forms, some of which would be arguably legal. It could be simply economic links. Some of the stuff, if you've read the Steele dossier, could be pretty seamy, but nonetheless very concerning. And why do we care about that? We care about that because the behavior of the president in a whole lot of dimensions is odd. In the arena of Russia, it is particularly odd. He will, and I made this point in my opening statement, he is quite happy to attack everyone. The cast of Hamilton, was it Barbara? No, it wasn't Barbara Streisand. It was Glenn Close. Sigourney. I can't even remember. Anyway, actresses, the Congress, Chuck Schumer, the British, the Germans, the Australians. He is happy to attack all of our allies, but remarkably says nothing critical of Putin or Russia. And that in and of itself is odd and curious, and therefore, is one of the many questions that is raised for the investigation. In the interest of being disciplined about time, let me leave that there and talk just for a moment about where we are in the investigation. Today's announcement of Chairman Nunes stepping aside, not as chairman of the committee, but as the leader of this investigation in favor of Congressman Conaway and Rooney and South Carolina, Trey Gowdy, how can I forget? I think it's welcome news. And by the way, I say that with some personal sadness. I consider Devin a friend. I think he's fundamentally a decent guy. I think he made some decisions over the course of this investigation that sadly compromised the perception of the impartiality of the investigation. And this midnight run, this escapade to the White House was not the first. We had the story a few weeks prior about agreeing to, quote, knock down a New York Times story. And even prior to that, we had the chairman out there really praising somebody who I think is in particular jeopardy in this investigation, Michael Flynn. And it was one of those things where, poor Devin Nunes is out there saying that Michael Flynn is a victim of the swamp and of the liberal media and the swamp, and literally 6 hours later or something, he is forced to resign. So nonetheless, I think that it is really important to the perception of impartiality that he do what he ultimately did today. I don't have a lot of insight into what is actually happening. The Committee on Ethics has announced an investigation. Interestingly enough, they do not require a referral. You will know, of course, that is chaired and ultimately controlled by the chairman's party. So we're still sort of trying to piece together what the charges are and where the referral or where the idea for the ethics committee investigation came from. I will tell you though, and if you sort of detect a slight note of sadness in my voice, it's not so much about a personal relationship with Devin Nunes. It was that we were actually making pretty good progress. So while the chairman was doing these things on the outside, this really odd midnight run to the White House, we were actually working constructively together across the aisle and really making progress on this investigation. There was never any pushback from the Republican majority on witnesses, on documents to review, on our ability to see things, on the scope of the investigation, and our staffs were working hard and we were taking trips here and there to look at evidence. So my hope now is that the cloud of the questions of impartiality have been lifted in such a way that we can continue to make that sort of progress on what is really, really important. Backstopping us, of course, is the FBI investigation, and that's really important. We don't have hundreds of trained investigative agents. We don't have nearly the resources that the FBI does, and of course the FBI is really at the core of the questions and will help us answer the questions that are raised by Russian activities and the possibility of collusion. So just a couple of closing thoughts here. Where do we go from here? We need to finish this investigation, and I should add, it's a little bit like being a second-string baseball player. I really wish that we had an independent, outside, bipartisan commission. People always draw an analogy to the 9/11 Commission. Inevitably, those of us who are in Congress, we're political players. We can't escape our party label, and while I think many of us would avoid trying to do what the chairman did, we carry the team jersey. And so this is really something that should be done by an outside commission. The activity on the Senate, where you see Senator Burr and Senator Warner working very closely together, is driven, I think, both by good relationships and a little bit more thoughtfulness on that side of the building, I hate to say, but also, I think, by Senator Burr's understanding that if that investigation were to crumble or be compromised, the pressure for an outside commission of some kind would be overwhelming, and I suspect the Senate Majority Leader does not want to have to consider that in a realistic way, sadly. So just in closing, so where are we? This obviously needs to play out. Personal opinion, as somebody who's on the inside, this is not going to happen quickly. There is nothing there. This doesn't, I think, end with the conclusion that really nobody did nothing to anybody. But how serious it is, I don't want to characterize or prejudge because we're really sort of relatively early in the process of investigation. But we do have to do a few things. We need to think about a really concerted response to the Russian hacking. I am of the mind that then departing President Obama's response was inadequate to serving as the clear message to Putin that he will pay a very high cost for these sorts of activities. I don't think PNGing a bunch of diplomats and diplomats undercover or intelligence officers and just closing a few facilities does the trick. And exactly what that looks like is hard to fully formulate. I do think we can draw on our experience with NATO to come to the conclusion that our response needs to have the coordination and unanimity that NATO represents, especially since A, NATO is being targeted, and B, the gesture of answering this with NATO would be a good reaffirmation of our commitment to the North Atlantic Alliance. I think we need to think hard about that. I think we need to think hard but carefully about a cyber response. And we need to be careful because, and I think the president, I would maybe criticize him, the former president, for being a little overcautious in this regard, but we do need to extract a price. Putin understands transactional, he understands the world in transactional ways. And though I would want to be careful because we don't have norms, and I'm going to close on this point, we don't have norms that guide us in terms of proportionality, which, as you know, is a really key concept in the kinetic world. Because we don't have those norms, we would want to be very careful about setting off a cascading tit for tat in the cyber realm that results in hospitals being out of power or financial records lost or whatever it may be. Nonetheless, I do think one of the advantages of attribution being so difficult in this realm is that we could probably cause a lot of embarrassment, a lot of trouble for a lot of very important Russians in ways that would not necessarily be traceable to our activities. And then lastly, 2 points. One, I said I would wrap up with the concept of norms. I really think this is important, and I think we're underinvesting both time, effort, and energy in creating an analogy or an analog to the Geneva Convention, to the rules of armed conflict. It is really important with our adversaries that we understand doctrine in the cyber realm, how we're likely to respond, how we think about proportionality, coming to certain clearly, I should say clearly, but the Chinese in particular have been a little bit challenging in this regard. You know, you shouldn't bring down hospitals. We ought to get to a point where we could agree on certain off-limits behavior. So I really think we need to do that. We should also agree with the Iranians and the North Koreans, folks with whom we don't normally agree, that we will coordinate our approach against rogue non-state actors. There's no one, of course, who is exempt from attack by non-state actors. So I do think there's an opportunity, even with our most difficult interlocutors in this realm, who are the Chinese, to establish some rules of the road, some equivalent of the Geneva Convention or the rules of armed conflict. And let me just close with this point, because I think it's an interesting one that gets lost in this. The Russians have lost here in a narrow sense. It's pretty clear that early on here, and Putin's thinking had to have evolved in the way a lot of our thinking evolved. I think that 9 months ago he had no realistic expectation that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. He had profound antipathy to Hillary Clinton. I think 9 to 12 months ago, the idea was to disrupt and call into question our democratic processes as much as possible. And then we had a period when the candidacy of Donald Trump became more viable, and I think there was a sense of an ability to be able to work with this guy who oddly doesn't criticize us much, and I'll leave it there, but perhaps there are other reasons why they thought they could work with him. But if his objectives, Putin's objectives, which I believe they were that shortly after the election, the inauguration of Donald Trump, that there would be a concerted effort to lift the sanctions on Russia, to go easy on their occupation of Crimea, and to maybe cause us to forget about the fighting in Ukraine. If those were the strategic objectives of the Russians, and I think they were, this has really backfired, because even our president, who is, shall we say, unpredictable, I think is not going down that path. And of course, the scrutiny of the nation has been drawn onto Russia in ways that are very uncomfortable for them. So if there's one little gleam of hope in all of this, it is, well, two. It is that the Russians, this really backfired on them. And hopefully that in and of itself moderates their behavior and changes their thinking. And the investigation of which I am a part today, I think looks even better and more likely to succeed than it has in a long time. So I'll stop there and say again, thank you for your interest in this topic.
Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. Hi, everyone. Congressman, thank you, and thank you for sitting down with us to do this panel. We're going to be going pretty fast through a lot of topics here, but let me really quickly thank all of you for joining us. At the end of the row here, we have Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan has until moments ago, practically days ago, I suppose, been the U.S. Special Representative to Libya. He's got experience in investigations from every end that you can imagine. He's also one of the great U.S. experts on anti-money laundering. His experience in this kind of thing goes back to the days of the Iran-Contra affair. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Jen Palmieri, I think known to many in this room, was of course communications director for the Clinton campaign, and prior to that for President Obama. So Jen, thank you. You've experienced it in real life. And written about it recently in the Washington Post, so thank you for joining us. And Max runs the Moscow Project here at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and is a senior fellow working on Russia and European security issues. I'm going to start with you, Congressman, if I could. Obviously, there's both a lot of investigative activity and a lot of concern about whether there's the potential for an investigation, any of these various investigations, to actually get to those two issues you highlighted. What do the Russians do, and how, and what do we do about it? That, and then the collusion issue. How, especially within the committee and with the politics around it, clearly the fact that collusion is on the table is in some ways making it more difficult to have true bipartisan collaboration. In some ways, I think there's a fear factor on that side, on the Republican side, that this is potentially, you know, the greatest political scandal in a generation or two. And how do you see your colleagues addressing that, and how concerned are you that the focus on collusion is making it hard to get to the bottom of the matter on what Russia did?
Yeah, it's a great question. The characterization is right. I mean, there are two investigations underway by my committee. There's a Democratic investigation that is about the possibility of collusion and questions about whether there is leverage on the president. And then if you watch the open hearing, whatever it was, 10 days ago, you'll know that there's a Republican investigation which is solely focused on leaks. And since then, the focus on that side of the aisle, and I don't mean to be disparaging of this. I actually think there's some Republicans in the committee who are acting in good faith and want to be more aggressive about some things that are very politically difficult and perilous for them. But the Republicans are investigating leaks. Most lately, they are investigating the unmasking procedures, which we can get into if it's interesting to people, and the possibility of Susan Rice's involvement in unmasking. And by the way, those are all legitimate topics for our committee to think about that have absolutely nothing to do with what we're here to talk about today, and that's not an accident. There are two things going on. Number one, an effort to distract from the storyline, which came out so dramatically in that open hearing, that there is a there to investigate. And then secondly, and bizarrely, and here I usually give my political opponents the credit of thinking that they're acting rationally. A lot of what we've seen in the last 2 weeks has been a desperate effort to find backing for the absurd presidential tweet that the Obama administration was wiretapping Trump Tower. Now, closing this out, I'm not the most experienced politician in Washington, but if I do something that stupid, I will put it in the same category of 4 million fraudulent votes and the biggest inauguration crowd ever, which is an obvious falsehood that if I just don't talk about it, it fades into the past. Instead, they've completely kept that alive with behavior that may actually end some careers.
Thank you, Max. This is, I think, a good pivot into what you might want to talk about. So you're running a project that's looking at basically all aspects of Russian involvement, including the question of collusion. Can you tell us how you're thinking about that?
So, the way I sort of came at the Trump-Russia connections, and it was during the course of the campaign, and I think for people in sort of the foreign policy expert community, it was all incredibly striking that there were sort of three things that Trump was basically consistent on throughout the campaign. It was anti-immigration, anti-trade, and pro-Putin. One of those is not like the other. And it was, there's no political constituency in the United States to be pro-Russia. So, I think a lot of people were seeking to explain, to sort of explain it away and say, well, maybe he has an inclination to support authoritarian leaders. that was sort of thrown around a lot during the campaign to kind of explain his behavior. Another aspect is maybe his business ties are just so extensively linked to Russia that he didn't really want to say anything negative. But then, in early January, we have the intelligence community report. And this, I think, was sort of a game changer for, at least for a lot of people in the foreign policy community. I think this is one of these bizarre political scandals where actually folks in the foreign policy community are way more exercised than many on the Hill, many political pundits, because this is sort of very inexplicable behavior. The Republican foreign policy establishment for the last 70 years has effectively based its core principle has been being hawkish on Russia. And here, Trump is totally upsetting that apple cart. But what did the IC report said? It said there was effectively a Russian campaign to elect Donald Trump, to help elect Donald Trump. So what we now know is that there was two campaigns. There was a campaign on the part of the Russians and a Donald Trump campaign to elect Donald Trump. So what you have to believe there's no collusion, is that these two campaigns were completely siloed, that they never interacted. Now, Jen can talk about the hectic and frantic nature of a campaign, but you're constantly trying to get ahead. You're constantly trying to hit your opponent, know what the next news cycle is. And then you have to think about Donald Trump as a businessman, constantly sort of skirting the line when it came to a lot of rules and regulations, being sued, Trump University, and having settlements and settling, or having lawsuits and settlements. So then you have this kind of bright line where they're supposed to not, the campaigns are supposed to not talk to each other. Yet now we're learning all these connections. The Paul Manafort being his campaign manager, Carter Page being potentially recruited by Russian intelligence. And the stories go on and on and on. And I think what happens is that people in the public sort of look at this and it's a cacophony of stories that are coming out pointing to kind of individual characters. But what this is sort of uncovering is that this wasn't there weren't two siloed campaigns. We now know of all these contacts and all these connections. And now we know that there's an FBI counterintelligence investigation into collusion. So where, I think where we are coming at this now is that there is so much to look into in terms of Trump's past business dealings, in terms of campaign contacts, that this is sort of makes Watergate, which was essentially a metro section story, look pale in comparison in terms of the complexity of the potential relationship. Now, this all, as Adam Schiff said, could just be a happy circumstance. But I think there's more and more ties that make this look like there actually were connections, and then we need to investigate this.
Jen, thanks, Max. Jen, can you just you wrote about how our response, how the worst outcome, the best outcome for Putin and the worst outcome from us is apathy.
Yeah.
That we end up being, it's just too much, we don't care, because what's happened is a threat to our republic, not just a threat to one political party or one candidate. But can you take us a little inside the moment when you guys realized what was actually going on in the late summer, early fall?
I don't know that I really want to invite anyone into that.
That's fair.
To that world, but I will. Yeah, it was even a surreal experience for us, and it was our campaign. So I did appreciate that for the press to absorb, in addition to what a unconventional, to put it mildly, candidate Trump was, and all of the sort of crazy theater that was happening on stage. The idea that behind the stage that the Trump campaign was coordinating with Russia to defeat Hillary Clinton, it was just too fantastic for people to, for the press to to process and absorb. And for us, it did feel, that whole campaign experience was pretty surreal without Russia, but then I would go back, I was mostly on the road, go back to Brooklyn and, hear from and mostly our sources were was the press that work in the intelligence sphere, right? That's where we heard things of. That's where we learned of the dossier and the other storylines that were swirling about, and then just trying to process well, how do we, and along the way, the administration during the summer started confirming different pieces of what they were concerned that Russia was doing, and how do you weave that storyline into this fight you're trying to have with Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And that was a really hard thing because, we were caught in a catch-22. People didn't care about Russia because they never heard anybody talk about it. So in order to make it an issue, Hillary Clinton needed to talk about it. But then if she was talking about that, she's not talking about the economy. She's not hitting Trump on something that we knew voters found compelling. And so that was and we did finally get to the point on October 7th, where we thought that was when the administration came out with a very stunning, as somebody who worked in both the Obama and Clinton administration, I appreciated how stunning it was for both the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence to put out a statement, a long statement, that said with high confidence that Russia was interfering in the election and that they were also directing the timing of the leaks, and even named the institutions, even named the WikiLeaks, DC Leaks, and Guccifer as being Russian-led, and how stunning that was to be that certain, that public. Of course, that same day, the Access Hollywood tape came out, and that same day, WikiLeaks, I don't believe coincidentally, started their leaks of John Podesta's emails, and then we were, that was 3 weeks out, and after that, the rest is quite literally history. But that's what we were battling, and it was. So I do think that the answer for Democrats now, and appreciate the congressman's efforts and all of the Democrats in both the House and Senate Intel have been tremendous. You just have to talk about it more and make it more real for people, and it's also ultimately probably our best defense. This happens again for the American public to have absorbed what's at stake.
One of the things that that is underneath what you just talked about is the fact that one of our major political parties was the victim of crime. Right? This is both an act of aggression by a hostile power. It's also criminal action by a host of individuals and entities. It is illegal to hack people and release their information in this way. It should be, and it's interesting to see how we would feel about this kind of thing happening to ourselves and how we might feel about it happening to public personas. And I want to turn to you, Jonathan, because your experience on investigations goes way back. But what are the crimes and misdemeanors that potentially lie in this sort of this mountain of information on Russia and our election and going back?
Well, there are some crimes that we know took place, and there are other crimes that there are serious allegations about which may well have taken place. And let's start with the ones that we know took place. The DNC hacking involved thousands of counts of cybercrime. Anyone who participated in that, who knowingly used the information that was generated from it, who reached an agreement to make use of that information, are all potentially indictable on tens, hundreds, thousands of separate felonies. That's not the only crime, but that's one that we know took place, and it's important that we find out who was responsible for those crimes and that justice is done in relationship to all of those people, whoever they may be, whether they're Russians and Americans, Americans and others. There are also laws which prohibit colluding with a foreign government, private correspondence with foreign governments to defeat the policies of the United States. That's 18 U.S. Code Section 953. There's the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which if you're acting as an agent of a foreign official or even a foreign person, to influence U.S. public opinion, American public opinion, not just to lobby, not just to talk to officials, but to influence public opinion. That's a felony if you don't register under FARA. Of course, federal election laws forbid foreign money. You're not allowed to take contributions from foreign people and put into a federal election campaign. So if Russia put Russian money or former Soviet Union money into our elections and any American agreed to do that, that American faces serious criminal risk, including prison time. There are allegations that are pretty broad about how Russia infused funds into the pockets of a variety of Americans associated with the Trump campaign or the Trump organization. I don't know whether those allegations are true or not, but they raise questions about violation of U.S. Money laundering laws and tax laws. For example, if you have a foreign bank account, you got to check off a box, Schedule B. It says, yep, I've got a foreign bank account. If you've got 10 or 20 of them, you need to let the federal government know each year that you have them. Fill out a form expressing exactly how much. Some people associated with the Trump campaign had foreign bank accounts. I don't know whether they let the government know in real time or not. I know when I was practicing law in this area, buccaneers, American buccaneers operating overseas, almost never filed FBARs. It was a huge liability. I had a very successful legal practice, taking advantage of the fact that renegades didn't tend to file FBARs. There were a variety of things you could do, either to help them fix it or to exploit it if you were on the other side of it. So there's the FBAR issue. I note that Trump University was sued in a RICO, in a civil racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization action that was settled after he won the presidency, right after the campaign. If you violate 2 or more predicate offenses, which include money laundering and fraud and a wide range of other things, you can be gone after civilly or criminally, depending on the standard. As a racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization, you can have your assets seized, pay the injured parties triple damages. It's a brutally stringent law to go after organized crime. I don't know whether that applies in this case, but we need to know the facts so that the criminal laws can be applied. As we know for sure that some U.S. criminal laws were violated by some people in connection with this campaign. We need to know everybody involved and then apply the laws to the facts after we learn the facts in full.
I mean, I think that's something that people underappreciate, right? And sometimes it leads you to wonder whether these Trump ties is where, investigations tend to be balls of string. It gets pulled on and it goes further and further. And I wonder, Congressman, as you've had sort of the beginnings, sort of interrupted moment here, but it seems like you guys are getting back on track to continue this investigation. But do you have a sense, and I know you can't tell us too much about what's actually happening, but do you have a sense of how far this might lead? I mean, does it start extending into business ties between the Trump organization and Russia that go, far precede our election, or do you think it is limited to our election?
Well, there's really separate issues. I suspect that there were people around Trump. We sort of know this from some of the people that were doing business in Trump Tower who had possibly legal, possibly illegal reasons to do business with the Russians. The crew that is around him, whether we're talking about Stone or Manafort, these are not people that you think of as very, very deliberate and ethically pure, maybe. And so at a minimum, the questions that are raised, all of these ties. I mean, I've run 5 campaigns. I'd be shocked if anybody associated with any of my campaigns ever had contact with any foreign official, much less the Russians. From the Attorney General to Paul Manafort to Roger Stone to I could go on and on to Jeff Sessions. There were these unbelievable contacts, and 2, there was usually dissembling associated with the exposure of those contacts. That alone, combined with, again, I sort of made reference to this, the White House, and you don't draw conclusions from this, but the White House has not acted like an innocent party. They've denied, they've obfuscated, they've changed the topic. Again, hard for me to put myself in the shoes, but if I were the president, I would say, I need to get beyond this. So you know what? We're going to do this investigation in a turbocharged kind of way, get all the investigators in here, we're going to be done, out, and a week from now I'll be talking about something, or a month from now I'll be talking about something else. They've, of course, acted in exactly the opposite fashion, which only lends energy to our need to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's also a very interesting point. Why is it not actually becoming in their interest to advocate for a major investigation?
Get it done.
The congressman has to leave in about 2 minutes, and we're going to continue our discussion a little longer because we got started a little late. So I actually I'm going to take one question from the audience for the congressman. I'm going to go right down in front, the gentleman in the gray blazer.
You mentioned, Congressman, I think that you had seen
Could
My
you
name's-
please say who you
My
are
name's
and
Mark
then go for
Kozenbaugh
questions.
from Reuters News Agency. You mentioned that you had seen now the stuff that Nunez was talking about, I think.
I didn't mention that, but so I have not seen them. I expect to see them. I
Okay.
expect to see those intercepts very soon.
Have you heard anything that would in any way substantiate any of the allegations that are being made about Susan Rice or anything else to support the White House claims or the Republican claims or Nunez's claims?
Sadly, I can't say that. I can't. We are trying to be appropriate and proper with respect to how we talk about classified information. I don't know if Susan Rice is in any of those intercepts, but this White House, I suspect, the idea that she is a violation of our law. So we're trying to be very, very careful on my side of the aisle with respect to how we characterize or talk about classified information. The good news is that my understanding, and this is sort of the next 2 to 3 hours kind of thing, my understanding is that all members will be given access to all of the material that was shown to both Nunez and Schiff.
At your place or at NSA or at the White House?
At an outside agency. Yeah.
Let's do one more. Gentleman, I'm going to go to the gentleman here in the tie and the gray shirt. Sitting down.
Eric Chenoweth, Institute for Democracy in Eastern Europe. It strikes me that the collusion angle, there are lots of strings to try to pull here, but the complicity angle is already there. The Trump campaign was complicit in the Russian operation, and the House investigation has not been focusing on that angle. Will it, as the Senate investigation is going?
Maybe, can you just clarify for me what you mean by you're certain they were complicit?
On October 7th, the intelligence community issued a statement that said WikiLeaks was releasing Russian intelligence-generated material. After that, Trump welcomed WikiLeaks, produced and used it, pro-Trump media, the Trump campaign, almost based its campaign from October 7th to November 7th
I got it.
on WikiLeaks. That's complicity. And that's an element that I think the American public is not focused on. And the Senate open hearing started to go there, but then it went into closed hearings. And I was wondering if there is going to be more openness, open hearings that would go through that.
Like Rubio made an issue of it.
Yeah, no, I take your point, and I understand thank you for clarifying. I understand what you mean by complicit, and I guess I'll say two things about that. Right now, and remember, we're still in the early days of this investigation. We've now agreed on an aggregated witness list. We're running around town looking at documents, so we're in the very early stages. We really, right now, are focused on this from two angles, counterintelligence and, of course, the legal angle. Were there crimes committed? The stuff, it's interesting to consider when the presidential candidate invites the Russians to hack. I'll leave it to hack his opponents. I'll leave it to the lawyers to figure out whether that, in fact, was in some way in violation of the law. And you're right. Right now, we are focused on counterintelligence and on violations of the law. But and I'm glad I can make this point as my last point. Just because it's not the current focus of our official investigation, as citizens, we cannot let the word is normalization of that kind of behavior. We can't let it. I find myself doing this. Oh, this is just the president lying about inauguration-sized crowds, about the president's wiretapping. I mean, I'm getting into the frame of mind of normalizing this behavior. I don't know if it's legal or illegal, but boy, do we ever erode the value of our democracy by eroding our motive power as citizens if we let that slide in our own minds.
I want to everybody please give the congressman a round of applause. I know he has an important
Nice to see you.
place to get that is probably related to all of this. Thank you very much for joining us. We're gonna continue for 15 or 20 minutes. I'm gonna go back to the panel and go back to questions from the audience after that. Jen, this is Did we cross during the campaign? I mean, I imagine that none of the 16 Republican candidates and none of the other Democratic candidates had people with any contacts with Russia, or if they did, it would be extraordinarily few in passing somewhere. So we seem to be really dealing with something new and something we're not necessarily prepared to deal with and process. So I hear you saying we have to talk about it more. We have to, but like, what is that? You know, how do we keep the focus on the fact that this is disastrous for any political party, and that this could be something that bites a Republican just as much as a Democrat if it becomes the new normal for American elections to have this kind of outside interference?
I was surprised there was the only candidate on the Republican side that I recall saying anything of concern about Russia was Marco Rubio. He was no longer a candidate, but he was one of the few people who, when WikiLeaks started in earnest dumping all of Podesta's emails saying, we shouldn't use this, we should not use this politically, we shouldn't talk about it, we shouldn't be talking about the contents of his emails because it could be because you are aiding the Russians in this effort, and it could also be us someday. It is, I think that this White House is just a whole other beast in terms of how they consider politics and engaging with the public, because I do think another White House would have an appearance of saying, no one wants to resolve this more than I do, no one wants to get to the bottom of this more than I do, and be concerned about wrapping up an investigation, at least appearing to be concerned about it. So I think that we haven't. This is not going to go away for sure. The Russians will, and other countries will probably attempt to do this now, and it's part of our. It's ironic to me that most of Trump supporters are very wary of globalization, and this is like the ultimate political act of globalization is the Russian interference in the election. It doesn't seem to bother them at all, but that it will happen on the other side too.
Can I just make one point off of that? I think that's part of the reason why we need an independent commission is, I think the congressman did a very effective job at laying out, we need to figure out how to actually respond to these events in the future and how to have a measure of deterrence to deter foreign countries from doing this again. And one of the things that the 9/11 Commission did, while it looked into kind of the intelligence gaps and how and why there were failures, it also reassessed the national security bureaucracy to say, okay, well, what do we need to do to prevent this from happening again? What are the steps that we should take? And currently, that's just not happening around Washington. Now, the Obama administration was in the middle of kind of doing such an effort when the election happened, and suddenly there was no point in sort of handing that off to a new team, and so that effort sort of stopped, and so we PNG'd, or the Obama administration PNG'd 32 individuals. But the Trump administration, at least as far as I know, and it doesn't seem like anything is happening in the Congress, of what we need to do about this to prevent this from going forward. Because the next time, it could well be a conservative Republican that has anti-Russian views, then the Russians or the Chinese or whomever may decide to intervene on behalf of the Democratic candidate that is non-interventionist or that doesn't. So this is really a bipartisan issue and something that we as a country need to get to the bottom of. And frankly, and currently, we are not doing that. And that is really troubling.
One of the things I would note from that is investigations aren't mutually exclusive, right? So the 9/11 Commission came, over a year after there had been a lot of congressional investigations into 9/11, and in most of these past major moments when we've required this kind of investigation, you've had congressional inquiries. Every committee of jurisdiction has something it can be investigating. You've had select committees. You've often had independent commissions. You've often had FBI and justice investigations, and also special or independent counsels and prosecutors. But I wanted to ask Jonathan, you can pick up on this as well, but also what should the public be looking for? I mean, on the one hand, this is going to be a long process, so we shouldn't be expecting instant gratification. A serious investigation is going to take a lot of time and probably be going through millions of pages of documents. What should the public be looking for, and how should we be demanding a real investigation? How do we know we're getting real investigations?
Well, let's look again what happened. We know about the hacking of emails, but that wasn't just the hacking of emails. It was also the development of fake news, the use of bots, as the congressman discussed, an elaborate propaganda operation emanating from overseas and getting into the United States. Now, this did not only involve Russians. It involved the decision by a variety of organizations, including legitimate mainstream news organizations, but not just them. Some of them were fake websites, pop-up websites existing only to disseminate Russian propaganda, or Russian-funded or controlled, I believe. So first, we have to get to all of the facts regarding the entire Russian propaganda operation. We also need to get to all the facts about the financial flows from overseas into the United States. Now, to some it might look like, hey, okay, you've got the Trump organization involved with a bunch of Russian organized crime guys. You've got the Kremlin doing what it's doing to influence us, as it did with the Kremlin Playbook, a wonderful study by CSIS, which came out in October in 6 countries in Eastern Europe. The same techniques they used here, same things that were done in connection with Brexit. There's that. I believe you have to look at the entire picture to see whether, in fact, this became an integrated conspiracy. Whether there are things that unite all of these disparate activities. If you see financial transactions involving all of the players that become integrated, then it starts getting to look like a conspiracy. So following the trails, the money trails, as well as the information trails, is absolutely essential. Now, for my sins, 20 years ago, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement. And I was tracking a guy named Semyon Moglievich, sometimes called the Brainy Don. He lives in Moscow. He happily lives in Moscow. He's semi-retired in Moscow. But back then, he pioneered the movement of dirty funds from the former Soviet Union into the United States. They would launder them through a legitimate, quasi-legitimate, it wasn't actually legitimate, U.S. company based in Pennsylvania, publicly traded, and I think it was the Toronto or the Vancouver, or maybe both stock exchanges, taking their dirty money and transforming into clean money and laundering billions that way. FBI was investigating it. Took them a long time. Eventually they indicted him. Didn't seem to bother him. He's still doing what he's doing in Moscow. Well, Semyon Moglievich's associates are now turning up in a variety of press accounts of real estate transactions involving Trump-related properties. Well, that's disturbing to me. It's disturbing because the biggest Russian organized crime guy I was tracking 20 years ago shows up in transactions that relate to things that happened in this campaign with somebody who's now president of, with the organization of somebody who's now president of the United States, through a guy named Felix Sater, associated with a company called Bayrock, and it all gets complicated quickly, sure. I know from my background in money laundering that one of the greatest ways to launder money is to invest in high-end real estate. Why? Because it's not an easy fixed price. You don't have price transparency. You can set the price in various ways. The funds can come from overseas and go in to buy property. You can have a different person own the property and transfer wealth that way. So if I want to make you rich, but I don't want to give you any checks, all of a sudden you're the ownership of a high-rise condo somewhere, which was originally in the name of Center for American Progress Action Fund, LLC. And it's transferred to you. And that's me. It always was me. And so all of a sudden you've got those assets you can spend. Now imagine, for example, that you're a foreign government. You want to launder money in the United States for domestic espionage operations in the United States. It'd be a great way to do it. This is the method in which Colombian drug traffickers used all over Latin America and Miami in the 80s and 90s. It's a form that Russian organized crime has used in the past. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see the same kind of patterns involving some criminal people and some Russian officials showing up in current investigations of things associated with Trump properties in New York on the one hand and Florida on the other hand. I don't know what the meaning of it is. It may all be coincidental and innocent and merely peculiar. That's possible. But Occam's razor tends to suggest that the simplest explanation for things often turns out to be the mostly truest explanation of things. So I'm looking for things that might simplify and organize all this crazy stuff. And the more one looks at that, the more one sees these ties link up, coalesce, organize, and resolve into relationships that actually make some sense. So we need to get below what we can see on the surface and understand what actually happened. I don't know if we're going to see a racketeering, influence, corrupt organization in back of things. I don't know who's going to be indicted. But boy, do I know the American public needs to be able to get at the facts so we can look at them and then justice can be done.
One more question, unless one of you has a specific reaction, but to Jen, fake news. How do you, as someone putting a communications hat on, how do you deal with just fake stuff, other than saying it's fake, that comes out and sort of gets into the circulatory system, that finds its way from a fake website into people's Facebook feeds, into the voices of a candidate, into the mainstream media, and then suddenly become a thing that we all have to talk about, even though we actually all know it's fake?
Yeah, I think probably the greatest disruptive challenge that our society has yet to absorb or even begin to process how to absorb is the impact of the fact that any one person on the planet can communicate with every person on the planet at any moment. Any person can do that. There used to be a number of gates you had to go through before your voice could be heard. And I think that change, I think, is responsible for a lot of what we see happening, particularly in Western countries. So I think that we haven't even begun to process it. I think that in the short term, the way to combat the fake news is whereas there had always been a default position in my line of work that you don't want to lift something up because you don't want to get it more attention. And I think now you just have to say, this is, if I did it now, if I had such a thing now, I would have on a campaign website, this is here on our site is all the fake news. Make sure your friends know that that's fake. And you would actually do that and combat it in real time. One other thing I would say about what people should be looking at now, though, is also what's happening. The White House is also now experiencing the traditional Washington phenomenon of the cover-up. I think the crime here is the big problem, but now they are now engaging in what you saw transpire over the course of the last week and what we've learned about how they're handling this on the inside now. The 30-year-old Ezra Cohen Watkin, if I'm saying his name right, who's put in charge of national intelligence at the National Security Council, the guy who was brought in by Flynn, McMaster tried to fire. No, Steve Bannon is gone from the NSC, but our friend Ezra is still there, even though McMaster tried to fire him. And he was, as the Post reported, he was protected by both Bannon and Kushner. And it was said that he has, since he got to the NSC in January, been looking to see what intelligence the United States intelligence community had on the Trump campaign's interactions with Russia, also known as going in to see what damaging goods they have on us so we know how to cover them up. And it's so obvious what is happening is that we have a pipeline established at the NSC that is funneling information, presumably to Fox, to Breitbart, to the president himself. It's just the most absurd kabuki theater I've ever seen a White House do, where Trump is tweeting about Fox reporting that is very obviously being leaked coming from this particular pipeline. And this is a White House that's very undisciplined, and this is a president that's very undisciplined. I'm sure no one is protecting him. Often in a White House, you try to protect the president from knowing too much about an evolving situation so that you're only giving the president solid, good facts. I'm sure no one is protecting this president, which means he is probably very deep in the management of this story and, story, to be generous, managing of a spin to be sort of generous as well, or going all the way to trying to cover up damaging information. And so it's what's happening in real time now that people also need to be paying attention to and that the committee should be looking into.
Okay, I'm going to go to the audience. You guys can, as you answer questions, say whatever it was you also wanted to say. Right here in the front.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is that if it's proven that Russia has violated American sovereignty, how America should or could treat punish Russia, given that Putin might be so powerful, it's next to God that he is able to influence 61 million voters who voted for Donald Trump. Putin is able to influence their mind. I mean, to me, he is very, very powerful. So can we offer him American citizenship and come here and run election? He could easily win election if he can have this loose cannon make our president. Why can't he win the election? Thanks.
Okay, so how can we respond? Let me take another. I'll take one more question.
I'm Ray McGovern from Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. I'd like to compliment Jennifer first and foremost for her wonderful, candid Outlook section piece where she shows how hard she worked and how successfully to make sure that the press played up the Russian angle rather than the content of those DNC
question,
emails.
Please.
Which
We
showed
have literally a minute.
Which showed that Hillary stole the election from Bernie Sanders, pure and simple. This is very interesting to me that everyone thinks as flat fact that it was Russia that hacked into the DNC. The President of the United States outgoing, Obama, disagrees. He said 2 days before he left office, he said, there is no conclusive proof as to how WikiLeaks got any leaked information from the Russian hacking.
I'm going to turn your soliloquy into a question, which is.
Does anyone think it very odd that people will be talking about there being something there and not nothing there when we're about to strike Syria in a thing that Congressman Hines and Congressman Schiff should be very much interested in? Instead, they're interested in this witch hunt. It's the only thing I agree with Trump on. This is clearly a witch hunt. There is nothing there.
I will answer your question, which is that if we have investigations, we will know what is there or is not. And I think everyone on this panel was careful to say, we don't know the facts, but we would like to know the facts. And that's what independent investigations are for. How, if Putin's had this influence, what are the options for responding? I'll go to each of you in turn.
Well, certainly, Mr. Putin has accumulated vast wealth during his incredibly extensive tenure running Russia, which now goes back through the presidency of Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama, and Mr. Trump. That's how long Mr. Putin has been in power and in a position to direct the resources of the Soviet state into the hands of a small number of people. So going after the assets is one thing you could do. What I remember about Iran-Contra is that every single thing that turned out to be true was denied and disproven by the perps and by those protecting the perps until it was eventually uncovered, bit by bit, as little bits of information came out until the entire picture emerged. The fact-finding process is incredibly important before one reaches ultimate conclusions. Now, it is possible that it was a 350-pound guy eating a hamburger somewhere in New Jersey who was responsible for the hacking of the DNC, which did take place, and the hacking of John Podesta, which did take place, and the accessing the multitude of state voting databases, which did take place according to the registrars of a variety of different states. And it's possible that same guy was responsible for the bots and the massive engagement on social media with fake news. And it's possible that same guy was the guy who got Russian organized crime figures into engaging in transactions in Trump properties and got the Russian organized crime figures to working and having business cards with the Trump organization. That is possible. But it doesn't seem very likely to me. It seems absurd. It seems of vanishingly low probability. When you have the U.S. intelligence agencies and the FBI, which take their jobs rather seriously and are not just organizations, but organizations made up of lots of human beings, take the same view on a topic like this, it tends to be because there's fact behind it. And having been inside the government and outside the government, I've seen how hard it is to get all those agencies to line up and say something about facts that have happened, because they've got different responsibilities, intelligence and enforcement. So we have a lot of judgment already going into this. We don't have the number of facts that the American public, including Mr. McGovern, deserve to have. We ought to get those facts out. It's surprising to me that so many people don't want to get at the facts. Let's just get the facts out so everybody can see it. That's what the investigations need to do. That's why there needs to be a bipartisan commission of some kind, fully staffed with enough lawyers and investigators to go after the information and put it in front of the American public and the world. No one should be afraid of it.
Jen?
I defer to you guys on the, we'll hear from Max on the
I think on
response.
Putin's involvement and Russia's involvement. Like, look, we don't really know the precise impact of everything that the Russians did during the campaign, and I kind of think, in some ways, if that was enough to turn the election or not, it's a little bit immaterial. And in what Putin was able to take advantage of, and what the Russian strategy has been, is to take advantage of the openness of not just the United States, but of European societies. And now, especially with the disaggregation of media, of the presence of social media, that the fact that where people get their information is through social media now more than ever, that this created huge information operation opportunities for Russia. And they have sought to exploit that and and with the fundamental goal of giving rise to anti-government, anti-establishment voices, conspiracy theories. So, when you have a guy who became a presidential candidate, was the principal person behind pushing the theory that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States, that looks like a guy that the Russians would really want to help support through an information operation. And the evidence is provided by the intelligence community when it did its report in January. And I would just point folks back to that with high confidence about the Russian intervention. And what we are seeing in Europe, the Dutch intelligence yesterday said that Russians were intervening in Dutch elections. And Marie Le Pen of the National Front appears in Moscow. It's later reported that she's seeking funding because she's struggling with funding her campaign. Now, all of these efforts are part of an integrated strategy on the part of Russia to sort of work to weaken liberal democracies from the inside, because frankly, liberal democratic states that are successful, that are transparent, that are operating successfully, undermine Putin domestically, because they provide an example to other people in Russia, and we saw the protests, the anti-corruption protests. They give a model of what Russia could be, and that is very scary if you're an authoritarian dictator.
So I guess that one of the answers there is that what Western societies can do is withstand this and keep their democracies strong. I just want to thank everyone who came out on a very rainy day for joining us today and joining us. To thank the Congressman, though he's departed, and thank my entire panel. Everybody have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Your piece is one of the best pieces I've read this year, period.